Hello, this is Samuel Guy in Hawaii with some questions for Epic Energy regarding his video about how loot farming will change between Borderlands 3 and Borderlands 4. Epic is awesome. His contributions to the community are numerous. He's ridiculously entertaining to watch and listen to, and he's just a damn nice guy, and I love him. But this video has me very confused. I've linked it in the description below. I also just saw the latest Moxie video where in one segment he basically makes the same claim. So let me see if I can summarize the key points and then explain my confusion. Fresh back from FanFest in LA, and Epic mentions having a conversation with Borderlands 4's creative director Graham Timmons about how loot drops work in previous Borderlands games, Borderlands 3 in particular, and how this will differ in Borderlands 4 and how that will make farming somehow better or easier. Okay. Epic mentioned that he did not record the interaction because he just, wanted to have a conversation with the man. This was not some formal interview, and I respect that, but it means I don't exactly know what was said in the conversation. With that in mind, his main point is that whenever a source in Borderlands 3 has 2 or more items in its designated loot pool, the actual percentage drop chances for each are significantly lower than what we think, what is typically listed in Loot Lemon. Gearbox has never published actual drop rates to my knowledge, and I don't expect them to ever do so, but Loot Lemon pulls its data directly from game files, and I've always found them to be extremely reliable. In any case, Epic claims that whenever we defeat said enemy, the game first determines if we get something or nothing, and then, if we get something, it then determines what that specific drop is. Okay, he uses a spinning wheel analogy with a segment of that wheel representing the loot drop or the loot pool's drop chance. Okay, spin the wheel, and if the pointer lands within that segment, we get something. Outside, and we get nothing. If we get something, it then spins a second wheel to determine precisely what. He uses Shiv as an example. Shiv has 2 items in his drop pool, the Ripper SMG and the Moxie's Bouncing Pear Grenade mod, each with a listed drop chance of 15%. So that segment takes up 15% of the wheel. We defeat Shiv, the game spins the wheel, and if the result lands inside the segment, which on average happens 15% of the time, then the game spins a second wheel with a 50-50 chance for us to get one item or the other, but not both. Okay. The supposed problem with this system is that the actual drop rate for each is not 15%, but more like 7.5%, because 15% only gets us access to the loot pool. We then have an equal chance of getting one or the other, but not both. So if we want the Ripper and not the Grenade mod, it can take longer than we expect given the drop percentage, because some of those drops which could be the Ripper are instead eaten up by the Grenade mod. Okay, if a loot pool has 3 or 4 or more items, it gets progressively worse. Okay, he then uses a wheel with that single segment instead divided into 4 separate adjoining segments to explain how things will work differently in Borderlands 4, claiming this will allow us to get 2, 3, or even possibly all 4 of the items in one attempt without any item eating up the chances of the others. There are several problems with these analogies and explanations. Okay, the first is that the current BL3 mechanics explanation does not work when 1 or more items in a pool have differing drop chances. Okay, Mouthpiece, the first real story boss, if we don't count Shiv, has 4 items in his loot pool. 1, the Killing Word, a blue ready pistol, is a guaranteed drop. We always get it, and that obviously works differently from the other 3. Set it aside. Okay, the other 3 include the Mind Killer, a legendary shotgun, the Nemesis, a legendary pistol, and the Echo 2, a white grenade mod. Now, the Mind Killer has a 20% drop chance according to Loot Lemon. The other 2, the Nemesis and Echo 2, each have a 15% drop chance. In that instance, what does this section of the wheel represent? 15% or 20%? If it's 20% of the circle and it represents the entire loot pool and the pointer lands inside it, then should we get or not get a shot at the 15% drop chance items? More importantly, if it's 15% of the circle, then we are not actually getting a 20% chance at the Mind Killer, since the wheel is only going to land on that section on average 15% of the time. So the idea of one spin to get access to the pool and then a subsequent spin to determine what we get from the pool doesn't work. It does not or cannot actually describe what already happens in a great many situations. Now, part of the problem is that the wheel analogy, while helpful, is not perfect, because it is, in fact, an analogy. What actually happens, if I'm not mistaken, is that as soon as we defeat a boss, the game generates a random number, RMG, between 0 and 1, and then compares that number to a given drop chance for a given item. Okay, for 15%, that would be 0.15. If the randomly generated number is equal to or less than 0.15, we get the item. If greater, we do not. Okay, it also works when we have 2 different items with different drop rates. In the case of Mouthpiece, the Mind Killer rate is 20%, while the Echo 2 and Nemesis are 15. If the random number is greater than 0.14 but less than or equal to 0.20, we get the Mind Killer. If it's less than or equal to 0.15, we get the Mind Killer and at least one of the other two. In that instance, it could generate a second number and then give one item out of it if it's 50.50 or less, and the other if it's greater than 0.50. That would also work with Epic's analogy if the wheel and segment look like this. But I don't think it does that, because that brings us to the second problem. The explanation of what happens to drop chances for items in pools containing two or more items does not, in my experience, reflect the reality of how Borderlands 3 actually works. In 5.5 years of playing this game and making content, and on several occasions testing out drop rates, the rates listed in Loot Lemon, which is my go-to source, have always been pretty much bang on. Okay, now I could dig through my files and try to find some of this data to demonstrate, but I decided to take a different approach. I instead farmed a number of different sources with multiple item drop pools and recorded the results, some of which you can see here. I farmed Shiv, Gigamine, and Azalea. 100 runs each, Mayhem 11, no Guardian rank, no special gear that might affect any drop rates. Each of these has a 2-item loot pool, and each item in that pool has a 50% listed drop rate, 15%. Now, 100 is actually not that big a sample size when we were talking about a 15% drop chance. Given that size, though, if 15% is accurate, I would expect to see each item drop roughly between, say, 10 and 20 times in 100 tries. If 15% is not accurate, or rather if, as Epic suggests, we only get a shot at one item each run, I'd expect to see numbers around half that size. What I got, though, was pretty much what I was looking for. Only the Rack Commander was slightly outside those parameters. That is the only instance where one might make the case that one item is eating up the chances of getting the other. Okay. To be fair, given the way probability actually works, which most people don't understand, it would not have been unusual for any of these numbers to be wildly off in either direction with only 100 runs. I could have gotten 2 Rippers and 25 Moxie bouncing pairs, and that would not have signaled a problem with the game. Probability is probability, and streaks happen quite often, and while they can be frustrating, they're not unusual. The fact that we got reasonably close to the listed chances with such small sample size is a little bit of, well, luck. Okay. What's telling, though, is that the average observed drop rates for each pair are very close to 15%, between 14% and 7%. And if we combine them all and average it, it works out to 15%. And since all three of these have 2-item loot pools, and each item has a 15% drop chance, what we are really looking at is a sample size of 300, not 100. The larger sample size reveals a drop percentage in line with what is listed for each, 15%, not half of that. Now, I should point out that in all three cases, I never saw both items drop at the same time. So it may be that the game will not currently do that, even though I think I recall that happening several times in the past. Then again, the chance of that actually happening, 2 items, both with a 15% chance dropping simultaneously, is 2.25%. Okay, and that's not what's important here. What's important here is that the notion that multiple items in the drop pool lower the chances of any one particular item dropping is not supported by these tests. But Epic's explanation may still hold some weight. I did some other testing. Okay, first, the demo Skagans, which have not 2, but 3 items in their loot pool. 2 legendaries and a blue rarity, all with the same 6.7% drop chance. Now, Loot Lemon says 6.7% times 2 because there are 2 demo Skagans, which is why I only farmed them 50 times, because killing 2 demo Skagans 50 times each is the same as killing one 100 times. Now, in the case of all 3 items, each outperformed that listed 6.7% drop chance. We got lucky, if you will. What I found interesting, though, is that in 50 runs, 100 kills, I never got more than one of these items from one demo Skagan. Again, no simultaneous drops. But again, the odds of getting 2 at once is about 0.45%, all 3 about 0.03%. Okay, let's do one more. The aforementioned mouthpiece. 4 items but 1 guaranteed, so we only look at the other 3. The Mind Killer observed drop rate was a little on the low side, given a 20% chance, but again, it's 100 runs. Okay, the Nemesis and Echo 2, however, are pretty close to where we might expect them to be. With Mouthpiece, however, we also saw 2 different items drop together on 6 different occasions. The Mind Killer and Nemesis both dropped together on 5 different occasions, and the Mind Killer and the Echo 2 just once. So, different items from the same pool can drop at the same time. That's not what I found interesting. What's interesting is that the Nemesis and Echo 2 never dropped together. And what do they have in common? Well, they have the same 15% drop chance. Is that really significant? I have no idea. It's impossible to say with such a small sample size. But again, even if they can drop together, the chances of it happening are like 2.25%. But seeing it happen so often with the Mind Killer makes one wonder. The game could be grouping items with the same drop rate together and yet preserving their individual 50% drop chances. I don't know. I'm actually digressed. I don't really know what the game is doing. just the results. Okay, the point is, given what I've seen, the problem Epic pointed out does not exist. Items that drop do not eat up the chances of other items in the same pool. It may feel that way sometimes, because probability is a funny thing that most people don't understand, but that's not what's happening. And the fix to this supposed problem, if I understand it, is something the game was already doing. I have always assumed that, with a few notable exceptions, whenever we defeat an enemy with multiple items in its pool, the game spins the wheel separately for each, okay? It's not that hard to do. In a 2-item loot pool with the same chances for each, it's just as easy, if not easier, than spinning once for access to the pool and then again to see what actually drops, okay? I thought that's the way it already worked. There are a few exceptions. The most obvious is Heavyweight Harker, who, despite having a pool consisting of all 24 Arms Race legendaries, always drops one, but never more than, say, 2 or 3. Then again, this would appear to be a case where one can get more than one item from the same drop pool. Okay, Wotan can drop all 5 of its exclusive items in one run. It did for me during the last BL3 hunt. But that's because we have 6 shots at them with a 55.1% chance each at M4 and above. 4 legs, the upper half, and the brain. Okay, I do not think the game spins the wheel for each item for each of those parts, just once. Okay, again though, the most common setup in the game, the 2-item loot pool, I've always assumed this spins the wheel separately for each. Okay, finally there's a third problem. The way Epic describes how it's going to work, again, using the wheel analogy with 4 items, is not any better. The example shown has 4 separate segments, 1 for each item, meaning a single spin of the wheel still only gets us one of those items. Okay, he says that we will have a chance to get 1, 2, 3, or possibly all 4 items in a 4-item pool in one run. No item will eat up any other. Okay, but this example does not explain how that is really going to work. And again, the simplest way to make it work, the way I thought it already worked, is to spin the wheel, generate a random number, separately for each item in the pool. So my question to you, Epic, is did I understand or misunderstand what you described? Can you please clarify these things, and/or perhaps ask Mr. Timmons if he has time in his undoubtedly busy schedule to clarify how things really currently work in light of what I pointed out, and how Borderlands 4 will in fact do things differently and somehow make it better. If I've screwed up and basically totally misunderstood and messed up, my logic doesn't make sense, let me know. If that's the kind of content I want to see more, comment, like, subscribe, stay safe, and thanks for watching.